everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about the books I read in, what month are we? July? June. I'm going to talk about the books I read in June. So I read 5 books and then I read some manga. June was a month of kind of meh. No books really excited me. One was very, very good. But in general, I wasn't very excited by the books I read. I don't know if it's a mood thing. Since the isolation started, I've, like a lot of people, I've been a little down, a little bit, feeling a little lonely, and I think that's affecting my mood. And while I have been escaping through reading, and I've definitely been enjoying the amount I've been reading, I think it's affecting sort of my emotional response to what I've been reading. But I think there is also an aspect that this month was definitely a month of experimental reading, so maybe books I don't typically read, and maybe that's also a reaction to that. So, I mean, it's probably just a combination of the two, but it was a little meh this week. Everything I read was good, but my emotional response was just like, okay, yeah, I read that, all right, it's checklist done. So to get into it, the first book I read was The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, who is a very, very famous science fiction author who's very much renowned for her beautiful literary writing style. So I first read one of her books last year. It is called The Lathe of Heaven. And so this is my second book by her, and this is one of her most famous books. It's even on the list of 1,000 books to read before you die. And I definitely see why it's on it. As I mentioned, she has this writing style that, yes, technically this is a science fiction genre, but this sort of blurs the line between science fiction and sort of what's considered literature. Just because she deals with topics that are very human, very much about society, very much about what I don't know where I'm going with this, but she's a very I would say a very well-rounded writer. So this book is about a mathematician called Shevek, who lives on the planet Anaris, which it was a rebel settlement from the other planet that is called Uras. And it's basically, Anaris is considered a utopia. There is no government. And so the people who live on that planet basically govern themselves. Everyone contributes. But as a mathematician, because it's a society because everyone has to contribute, the planet is a very dry planet. It has a lot of desert. It doesn't have a lot of water resources. So the people are often spread about to do jobs, like very labor-heavy jobs, instead of, academic jobs, more scientific type jobs. So he feels he's being restricted by his environment, and so he feels he needs to go to the other planet, Uras, to be able to sort of have the time to actually advance on this particular theory that he has. And it turns out, so he ends up going to Uras, and it's this very much, it's actually very similar to Earth. There's a lot of nature, it's very green, it's very prosperous, there are a lot of resources. And he goes into the society, and he's surrounded by basically the rich, the elite of the country, of the planet. And at first he's very much moved by it, he's very appreciative, he's very interested with it. And he loves the fact that he's surrounded by all these people who are very interested in his mathematical theory. But little by little, he realizes that there's something off about the planet. For example, where are all the poor people? And so he kind of finds himself questioning, why am I here? Why did they allow me to come here? What do they want from me? So it turns out it's very much a book about capitalism, anarchy, utopia, government. And so I think if you're very much interested in those topics, I mean, this is a fantastic book. It has literary merit. It's been critically acclaimed for a reason. My reaction, as I mentioned before, it's just all mood based. I'm very happy I read this. I enjoyed it. Will I remember it in the future? Not so sure, but this is a very good book. I know that. So the second book I read was the book I liked the least this month, and that's, so I learned how to say the word Evelyn Waugh. Last time I said Evelyn because I keep thinking this author's a woman, but they're not. Evelyn Waugh, so The Loved One. So this is the first book I read by this author, and I've since been told it's one of his worst. I can't judge because it's the only book I've read by them, but basically this is about the Englishmen in Hollywood. So there's this Englishman, what's his name, Dennis Barlow, who came to Hollywood with sort of, more or less grand ideas, but he's a very apathetic man. He's not a very ambitious man. He's a very lazy man. But because he's English, he's able to be in this very small English community that is made mostly of people who have very high credentials. And he decides to start working for a pet mortician. So it's basically a job where they do funerals for people's pets. And he ends up meeting this woman who works for an actual funeral service for humans. And it's sort of him pursuing her, but not so much because he loves her, but because it's almost a game to him. It's a game to him to take her away from his rival. And he's a nasty man, and this book is very much a satire on old Hollywood at the time, what it means to be in those sort of small communities. It compares, English nature versus American nature. And so, I understand the humor of it. I understand the satire behind it, but I wasn't fascinated by it. This is kind of along the lines of, the Great Gatsby era, which for me, not a big fan of. It's not something I really enjoy reading. Would I read other books by Evelyn Waugh? I think I would like to read one of his more famous books, but I think I'd have to be very selective as to which ones I choose. But his writing is, he's famous for a reason. His writing is very, very good. The next book I read was H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. When I did my English book haul, I lied on accident. I said I've never read him before, but I have. I've read The Island of Dr. Moreau, which I actually very much enjoyed. Enjoyed in the sense that I liked the classic horror behind the book. It was sort of absurd, but strangely horrifying. And so with this book, I've actually seen the movie with Tom Cruise, and although I didn't like the actors in the movie, the idea behind the aliens that come to Earth and the way they attack and the way they feed, I thought was actually very well portrayed in the movie. So I wanted to read the book. So basically this is just Martians. They're actually in London in the original book. They land near London and they start attacking. And this book is interesting historically in terms of the sci-fi genre, because H.G. Wells is credited with creating and inventing the heat ray, which comes in this book. So it's very fascinating in a historical sense to see where sci-fi came from and how it's evolved over the ages. In terms of plot, and it's not the most exciting book. It's not super gripping. I think maybe because I am reading it from a modern perspective, and I have seen a lot of sci-fi movies. I don't really read the genre that much, but I've seen a lot of sci-fi movies and I like them, and they're so visually appealing that I think from a modern perspective this almost seems a little bit too subdued, but it is still a good book objectively, and I did enjoy this. It's not, you know, my favorite book of the year, it won't be, but objectively in terms of a sci-fi historical idea, it's quite good. Also, something that really annoyed me, not annoyed me, but you know, it's amusing. And so when I saw the Reading Rush, what's it called? The suggestions, the prompts, there we go, the prompts. This fit pretty much every single prompt, and it was aggravating because it fits, you know, a title that starts with the, it starts with, you know, it fits the prompt of have you seen the movie before the book, read a genre that you don't typically read, even the first book you touch, because when I went to the English book sale, this was actually the first book I picked up there. So this filled so many prompts in the Reading Rush readathon, and I was like, ugh, well, you know what? I won the Reading Rush, been there, done that, check, completed, now I don't have to participate. So, but anyway, and joking aside, if you were planning on reading the Reading Rush, this is actually a really good one to read for that. The next book I read was the best book that I read this month. It was the most emotionally, it evoked the most emotional response. It was very gripping, very page-turning. And that's the memoir, My Hitchin Hell, about the Bataan Death March by, what's his name? Lester I. Tenney. So this is about an American soldier whose platoon surrendered to the Japanese just within a month of arriving in the Philippines. They surrendered to the Japanese, and they were taking on the 10-day Bataan Death March to the prisoner of war camps in the Philippines. And then he spent a year in the Philippines in a prisoner of war camp, and then he spent an extra 3.5 years in Japan in a prisoner of war camp. And this book is all about the struggles, the torture, the horrific things the Japanese did, and it's absolutely horrifying. The Japanese were terrible in this time period. I mean, when you think about humanity and you read these kind of books, you're just like, where is it? You know, how does this happen? How does man degrade to this kind of state in such a short amount of time, and be able to do this just for the loyalty of the country? It's very fascinating. And if you've never read a war memoir, but are interested, this would be a good one. But also, if you've never read a war memoir and you think, oh, that can't be interesting, you should still read this anyway. It's such a page turner. It's horrific. It's fascinating. It's gripping, and it is in a very important part of history. But it's never a dry read. It's just, you know, when you're reading war memoirs, you are emotionally connected, and that really makes them for very fascinating reads. So this was fantastic. The next book, I had to be very careful about what I say so that I don't offend everybody on the planet. But I read La Nuit by Elie Wiesel, which is Night, the very famous book about Auschwitz. This is a book in the US that is very commonly read in middle school when students do the World War II lessons. It's very often combined with the Diary of Anne Frank. I never read this in middle school. I did read Anne Frank, but I never read this in middle school. And I wish I had. I wish I had read it then, because I think this book, in a way, reads very juvenile. Obviously, you know, it's a book about Auschwitz. It's horrible, it's harrowing. But the fact is, when you compare it to this book, objectively, this is the better book. But when you think about it, you are comparing a 20-year-old soldier with a little bit of experience in war to a 14-year-old boy. So in terms of perspective, this is more interesting because it's better written. But this is probably, in a way, more emotionally gripping. But for me, when it comes to Auschwitz, I'm familiar. It was horrible. It was terrible. I can't believe that thing happened. But I wish I read in middle school. I mean, should everyone read this? Yes, obviously. Auschwitz and the atrocities that happened in the concentration camps in Germany during World War should never be forgotten. Is it very well written? Yes, it's very well written. But for me, at this period of my life, this doesn't do much for me. So, like I said, I wish I read this in middle school. So, good, obviously, historically speaking, fascinating, but objectively, for me, this is the much better book. And then, since I read so much about war and harrowing events, and I had a lot of mid books, I ended the month reading all 5 books in the ongoing, it's still ongoing series, but all 5 books in the極主夫道series. And this is one of those series, so it's about a former Yakuza who becomes a house husband. And it's basically a nichijou manga, so a manga about everyday life. And it's one of those books that as you read, you think, this is so stupid. This is the stupidest thing I've ever read, but it's so funny. It's so funny, and it's funny just because it uses so many puns on like Yakuza, and every time you think, oh, okay, maybe this gag is getting a little old, the author switches it up, and the characters are really funny. And for me, I love the kind of art in these books. It's very realistic, but still, anime style book, and it's funny. I really liked it. I'm really looking forward to the next book. So December can't come too soon. No. I love the summer. December, please stay away as long as possible. But in terms of anticipating the next volume in the series, I'm really excited about this. And I'm very glad that I read this, because this was a fantastic way to end my reading month. So that's it. I talked a lot more than I thought I would, but those are the books I read in June. I've already read 1 book in July, and I'm excited to see where my reading will take me from here. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys again next time. Bye!